The porcelain shattered against the hardwood floor like thunder in the silence of the grand dining room. 20-year-old Clara Brennan froze, her trembling hands still extended where the master's finest china plate had slipped from her grasp. The sound seemed to echo forever in the cavernous space, each fragment catching the afternoon light as it scattered across the polished floor. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Master Aldrich Blackwood's face turned crimson, his knuckles white as he gripped his silver-topped cane. "You worthless, clumsy fool," he hissed, rising from his mahogany chair with deliberate menace. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she dropped to her knees, frantically gathering the broken pieces, her fingers already bleeding from the sharp edges. But what happened next would change everything. Because sometimes, when darkness seems to swallow all hope, a single voice can pierce through the cruelty and remind us that compassion still exists in this world. Clara had been working at the Blackwood estate for 3 years, ever since her father's death left her family drowning in debt. The sprawling mansion sat like a fortress on the outskirts of Millbrook Valley, its Gothic towers and manicured gardens a stark contrast to the cramped quarters where the servants lived. She shared a tiny room in the basement with 2 other girls, sleeping on a thin mattress that barely cushioned her aching bones after 16-hour workdays. The Blackwood family had built their fortune on cattle ranching and land speculation, accumulating thousands of acres across 3 counties. Master Aldrich ruled his domain with an iron fist, treating his workers like property rather than people. His wife, Constance, was no better, a woman whose beauty had long since been replaced by bitterness and cruelty. Their son, Theodore, was away at university, leaving the estate under his father's absolute control. Clara's days began before dawn, when she would slip quietly from her bed to begin preparing breakfast for the family. She scrubbed floors until her hands were raw, polished silver until her reflection stared back from every surface, and served meals with the invisible grace expected of good help. The other servants whispered warnings about Master Blackwood's temper, sharing stories of workers who had vanished overnight for minor infractions. On that fateful Tuesday morning, Clara had been carrying the breakfast service up the narrow servant stairs when she heard shouting from the kitchen. Cook Maria Santos was arguing with the head butler, Winston Crawford, about missing supplies. The distraction caused Clara to hesitate at the top of the stairs, shifting her grip on the heavy silver tray laden with the master's favorite Wedgwood china. The dining room was a monument to the Blackwood wealth. Oil paintings of stern ancestors gazed down from gilded frames. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across burgundy wallpaper, and the massive oak table could seat 20 guests. Master Blackwood sat at the head, reading his morning paper with the same scowl he wore for everything that displeased him. At 55, he was a mountain of a man with silver hair and cold grey eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. Clara had served him countless times before, always managing to maintain the perfect balance of efficiency and invisibility that kept her safe. But this morning felt different. Maybe it was the argument she'd overheard, or the letter from home that had arrived the previous evening with news of her mother's worsening illness. Whatever the reason, when she leaned forward to place the plate of eggs Benedict before him, her usually steady hands betrayed her. The plate slipped from her fingers, as if in slow motion. She watched helplessly as it tumbled toward the floor, taking with it Master Blackwood's breakfast and her sense of safety. The crash seemed to shake the very foundations of the house, followed by a silence so complete that Clara could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Master Blackwood's reaction was swift and terrible. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound like fingernails on slate. His face cycled through shades of red before settling on a deep purple that made the veins in his temples bulge. 3 years, he said. his voice low and dangerous. 3 years, I've tolerated your presence in my house, and this is how you repay my generosity. Clara remained on her knees, still gathering the broken pieces with bleeding fingers. Please, Master Blackwood, I'm so sorry. It was an accident, I swear. Accident. He stepped closer, his polished leather boots crunching on the scattered porcelain. That plate belonged to my grandmother. It was irreplaceable. His cane whistled through the air, catching Clara across the shoulders and sending her sprawling. You will learn that carelessness has consequences in this house. The beating that followed was methodical and cruel. Master Blackwood used his cane like a weapon, each blow calculated to cause maximum pain without leaving marks that would be visible to outsiders. Clara curled into herself, trying to protect her head and stomach while he rained down punishment for her transgression. Between strikes, he delivered a steady stream of insults, calling her worthless, stupid, and ungrateful. You think you deserve kindness? He panted, pausing to catch his breath. You think your pathetic family's circumstances entitle you to my pity? You're nothing but a servant, and servants who can't do their jobs don't deserve to eat. He grabbed her by the hair, forcing her to look at him. You'll go without meals for 3 days, and you'll scrub every floor in this house until they shine. Maybe then you'll remember your place. As Master Blackwood raised his cane for another strike, the massive front door burst open. The sound of heavy boots echoed through the foyer, followed by a voice that seemed to fill the entire house with its quiet authority. Aldrich, what in God's name is going on here? The man who strode into the dining room was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and hands that spoke of honest work. His brown hair was streaked with premature grey, and his blue eyes held a mixture of compassion and steel that made even Master Blackwood pause. This was Samuel Rivers, owner of the neighbouring ranch, and one of the few men in the county who wasn't intimidated by the Blackwood name. Samuel took in the scene with a single glance. Clara huddled on the floor among the broken china, blood seeping through her torn dress, and Master Blackwood standing over her with his cane raised, his jaw tightened, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Put that down, Aldrich. Now. Master Blackwood's face flushed with fresh anger. This is my house, Rivers. How I discipline my servants is none of your concern. Discipline. Samuel's voice remained calm, but Clara could see the muscles in his jaw working. You call beating a young woman for dropping a plate discipline? That's not discipline, Aldrich. That's cruelty, and I won't stand by and watch it. He moved toward Clara, but Master Blackwood blocked his path. She's my property, Rivers. I paid good money to her family, and she'll work off every penny of their debt. If she can't perform her duties without destroying my belongings, then she needs to learn the consequences. Samuel's eyes never left Master Blackwood's face. No one is property, Aldrich. Not in this country, not in this century, and certainly not in front of me. He took another step forward, and despite being smaller than Master Blackwood, his presence seemed to fill the room. Now step aside. The tension between the two men crackled like electricity. Master Blackwood's grip on his cane tightened, but something in Samuel's steady gaze made him hesitate. After a long moment, he stepped back with visible reluctance. Samuel knelt beside Clara, his movements careful and gentle. Are you hurt badly, miss? His voice was soft now, concerned rather than commanding. Clara looked up at him through her tears, surprised by the kindness in his eyes. In 3 years at the Blackwood estate, no one had ever asked about her well-being. I'm all right, sir, she whispered, though her body told a different story. Every breath sent sharp pains through her ribs, and her shoulders felt like they were on fire. No, you're not, Samuel said matter-of-factly, and that's not your fault. He helped her to her feet with infinite care, supporting her weight when her legs threatened to give out. Mistakes don't deserve pain, miss. Remember that. Those words hit Clara like a revelation. In her world of constant fear and punishment, the idea that accidents could be forgiven seemed impossible. She stared at this stranger, who spoke to her like she was a human being, rather than a piece of property. Master Blackwood's voice cut through, the moment like a blade. "Rivers, I'm warning you. Take your hands off my servant and get out of my house before I have you arrested for trespassing." Samuel stood slowly, positioning himself between Clara and her employer. "I came here to discuss the boundary dispute between our properties, Aldrich, but I find myself dealing with something far more important." He glanced around the opulent dining room, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I've always wondered how a man accumulates so much wealth. Now I'm beginning to understand." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Master Blackwood's face went white, then red again. "How dare you come into my home and insult me? You may own the land next to mine, Rivers, but you're still nothing but a common rancher. I have influence in this county, connections you can't imagine, and I have something you don't," Samuel replied evenly. "A conscience." He turned back to Clara, his voice gentle once more. "What's your name, miss?" "Clara, sir. Clara Brennan." "Well, Clara Brennan, I want you to know that what happened here today was wrong. No person should be beaten for making an honest mistake." He looked directly into her eyes. "Do you understand that?" Clara nodded, though the concept still felt foreign. In her experience, mistakes always had consequences, usually painful ones. But this man spoke with such certainty, such conviction, that she found herself beginning to believe him. Samuel straightened and faced Master Blackwood again. "I want to make you an offer, Aldrich. Name your price for Miss Brennan's debt. I'll pay it in full right now." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Master Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he calculated both the monetary and strategic implications of the offer. "Her family owes me $800, he said finally, "plus interest, room and board, and damages. Call it $1,200 total." It was an enormous sum, more than most people earned in 2 years. Clara's heart sank, knowing that no one could afford such an amount for a servant girl. But Samuel didn't even blink. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Done," he said, reaching into his jacket for his checkbook. "I'll write you a check right now, and Miss Brennan comes with me." Master Blackwood's surprise was evident, but greed quickly overcame his shock. "You're serious? You'd pay $1,200 for a clumsy servant girl?" "I'm paying $1,200 for a human being's freedom," Samuel corrected as he wrote out the check. "There's a difference." As he tore the check from the book and handed it to Master Blackwood, Clara felt the world shifting beneath her feet. After 3 years of servitude, of living in fear and pain, a complete stranger was buying her freedom. But why? What did he want from her? Master Blackwood examined the check carefully, then folded it and placed it in his vest pocket. "Pleasure doing business with you, Rivers, but don't come crying to me when you discover what a worthless investment you've made." Samuel's jaw tightened again, but he kept his voice level. "I don't consider any human being an investment, Aldrich. That's where you and I differ." He turned to Clara. "Gather your belongings, Miss Brennan. You're leaving this place." Clara stared at him in bewilderment. "Sir, I don't understand. What do you want from me? What will I owe you?" The question seemed to surprise Samuel. He studied her face for a moment, taking in the fear and confusion written there. "You won't owe me anything, Miss Brennan. No one should have to buy their way to basic human dignity. But, sir, the money is mine to spend as I choose," he said firmly, "and I choose to spend it removing you from a situation where you're being abused." His expression softened. "You're free, Clara, really free. No debts, no obligations, no master to fear." The concept was so foreign that Clara couldn't quite grasp it. Freedom felt like a word in a language she'd never learned to speak. But looking into Samuel Rivers' honest eyes, she began to feel something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. As she moved toward the servants' quarters to collect her few possessions, Clara heard Master Blackwood's parting shot. "Mark my words, Rivers, that girl will bring you nothing but trouble. Some people are born to serve, and trying to change that is a fool's errand." Samuel's response followed her down the hallway. "The only fool here, Aldrich, is a man who thinks cruelty makes him strong." Those words would echo in Clara's mind as she packed her meager belongings into a small cloth bag. For the first time in 3 years, she was leaving the Blackwood estate not in shame or fear, but as a free woman. The future stretched before her like an unmarked trail, full of possibilities she had never dared to imagine. But as she walked back toward the dining room, her few possessions clutched to her chest, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that her real journey was just beginning. Samuel Rivers had saved her from Master Blackwood's cruelty, but what came next? What did freedom actually mean for a young woman with no money, no family nearby, and no skills beyond serving others? The questions swirled in her mind as she prepared to step into an unknown future, guided by a stranger whose kindness seemed too good to be true. But for the first time in years, the questions didn't terrify her. Instead, they filled her with something she had almost forgotten how to feel: curiosity about what tomorrow might bring. The carriage ride to Samuel's ranch passed in uncomfortable silence. Clara sat rigidly on the worn leather seat, her small bag clutched in her lap like a shield. Every bump in the dirt road sent fresh waves of pain through her injured ribs, but she bit her tongue rather than complain. Samuel drove with practiced ease, his weathered hands steady on the reins, occasionally glancing back at her with concern. The landscape gradually changed as they left the manicured perfection of the Blackwood estate behind. Rolling hills gave way to wider valleys, and the air carried the scent of wild grass and distant cattle. Clara had never ventured beyond the estate grounds during her 3 years of servitude, and the vastness of the open country both thrilled and terrified her. "How are you feeling?" Samuel asked, breaking the silence as they crested a hill. Clara straightened, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Fine, sir. Thank you for your concern." A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You don't have to call me sir, Clara. Samuel will do just fine." He paused, studying her face. "And you don't have to pretend you're not hurting. I saw what Aldrich did to you." The kindness in his voice almost broke her composure. Clara had learned to hide her pain so well that acknowledging it felt dangerous, like admitting weakness. I'm not used to being asked," she said quietly. "That's going to change," Samuel said with quiet certainty. "Starting now." As they rounded another bend, Clara caught her first glimpse of the Rivers Ranch. It was nothing like the Blackwood estate. No Gothic towers or manicured gardens, just a sprawling collection of practical buildings nestled in a valley between gentle hills. The main house was a modest 2-story structure with a wraparound porch, its white paint weathered but well-maintained. Corrals and outbuildings dotted the landscape, and in the distance cattle grazed peacefully in fenced pastures. "Welcome to River Bend Ranch," Samuel said, pulling the carriage to a stop in front of the house. "It's not much to look at, but it's home." Clara stepped down carefully, her legs unsteady after the long ride. The afternoon sun warmed her face, and for the first time in years she felt something approaching peace. There was no grandeur here, no overwhelming displays of wealth and power, just honest buildings built for honest work. The front door opened and a woman emerged onto the porch. She was perhaps 40, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, and kind eyes that immediately focused on Clara's injuries. Her dress was simple but clean, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in her own skin. "This is Elena Martinez," Samuel said, helping Clara with her bag. "She keeps the house running and makes sure I don't starve myself to death. Elena, this is Clara Brennan." Elena descended the porch steps with quick, purposeful strides. "Dios mío," she murmured, taking in Clara's battered appearance. "What happened to this poor girl?" "Aldrich Blackwood happened," Samuel said grimly. "She needs medical attention, food, and a safe place to rest." Without hesitation, Elena took Clara's arm gently. "Come, Mia. Let's get you inside and cleaned up." Her voice carried the warmth of someone who had mothered many children, though Clara would later learn that Elena had never had any of her own. The interior of the house was as unpretentious as its exterior. Clean, comfortable furniture filled rooms with wide windows that let in natural light. Books lined the shelves, and the walls displayed simple landscapes rather than portraits of stern ancestors. It felt like a home rather than a monument to wealth. Elena led Clara to a cozy bedroom on the second floor. "This will be yours," she said, opening the curtains to let in the afternoon light. "The bed is comfortable, and you'll have privacy to heal." Clara stared at the room in disbelief. It was larger than the basement space she'd shared with two other girls, with a real bed covered in a colorful quilt. A washstand stood in one corner, and a small desk by the window looked out over the ranch's peaceful landscape. "I don't understand," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is too much. I can't pay for this." Elena's expression softened. "Mija, no one is asking you to pay for anything. Samuel told me what happened. You're safe now, and that's what matters. But I have to work. I have to earn my keep somehow." "Later," Elena said firmly. "Right now, you need to rest and heal. We'll worry about everything else when you're stronger." She helped Clara out of her torn dress, clucking disapprovingly at the bruises that covered her shoulders and back. "That man should be ashamed of himself," she muttered, filling a basin with warm water from a pitcher, "treating another human being like an animal." As Eleanor gently cleaned Clara's wounds, she spoke in a soothing voice about the ranch, its history, and the people who worked there. Samuel had inherited the property from his uncle 5 years earlier, she explained. He'd been working as a ranch hand in Colorado when word came that he'd been left 2,000 acres and a struggling cattle operation. "He could have sold it," Elena said, dabbing antiseptic on a particularly deep cut. "Would have made him wealthy overnight. But Samuel isn't that kind of man. He saw the potential in this land, and more importantly, he saw the good he could do with it." Clara winced as Elena bandaged her ribs. "What do you mean?" "The ranch employs 12 people year-round," Elena explained. "Families who might otherwise struggle to make ends meet. Samuel pays fair wages, provides housing for those who need it, and treats everyone with respect. It's not the most profitable way to run a business, but it's the right way." The concept was foreign to Clara. In her experience, employers took as much as they could get while giving as little as possible in return. The idea of an employer who prioritized his workers' welfare over maximum profit seemed impossible. "He really doesn't want anything from me?" Clara asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her during the entire carriage ride. Elena paused in her work, studying Clara's face. "Samuel Rivers is one of the few truly good men I've ever known," she said quietly. "He saved you because it was the right thing to do, not because he expected anything in return. You're safe here, Mija. I promise you that." A soft knock at the door interrupted them. "Eleanor," Samuel's voice called. "Dr. Harrison is here." Clara tensed. She'd had little experience with doctors, and most of it had been unpleasant. In her world, medical attention was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Dr. James Harrison was a man in his 60s with silver hair and gentle hands. He examined Clara's injuries with professional thoroughness, asking questions in a quiet voice that invited honesty rather than demanded compliance. "You're lucky," he said finally, packing his medical bag. "Nothing appears to be broken, though. You'll be sore for several weeks. The bruising will fade, but you need to rest and avoid any strenuous activity." "Thank you, Doctor," Clara said, reaching for the small purse she'd hidden in her bag. "How much do I owe you?" Dr. Harrison exchanged a glance with Samuel. "Your bill has been taken care of, Miss Brennan. Just focus on getting better." After the doctor left, Elena brought Clara a tray of soup, fresh bread and tea. The simple meal tasted better than anything Clara remembered eating at the Blackwood estate, where servants received only leftovers and scraps. "Elena," Clara said, hesitantly, "may I ask you something?" "Of course, Mija. How long have you worked for Mr. Rivers?" Elena smiled. "I don't work for Samuel, Clara. I work with him. There's a difference." She settled into the chair by the window. "I came here 3 years ago with nothing but the clothes on my back and a baby I was carrying. My husband had died in a mining accident, and his family threw me out because they blamed me for his death." Clara's eyes widened. "What happened to your baby?" Pain flickered across Elena's features. "She was born too early, lived only 3 days. She was quiet for a moment. "I was ready to give up, but Samuel found me sleeping in his barn. Instead of throwing me out, he offered me a job and a place to stay. He held my baby when she died and helped me bury her properly." Tears sprang to Clara's eyes. "I'm so sorry." "Samuel gave me a reason to keep living," Elena continued. "He treated me like family when I had no one else. That's the kind of man he is." As evening approached, Clara found herself alone for the first time in years. She stood by the window, watching. The sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The ranch sprawled peacefully below, with workers heading home to their families after a day's honest labor. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Clara," Samuel's voice called. "May I come in?" Of course. Samuel entered, carrying a cup of tea and a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Elena thought you might like some chamomile tea before bed. And this?" He held out the package with a slightly embarrassed smile. "Well, Elena noticed your dress was beyond repair." Clara unwrapped the package to find a simple but beautiful dress in soft blue cotton, along with undergarments and a warm shawl. The fabric was finer than anything she'd ever owned, and it was clearly new rather than a hand-me-down. "I can't accept this," she said, though her fingers lingered on the soft material. "It's too much." "Clara," Samuel said gently, "you're going to need clothes. Consider it a practical necessity rather than a gift." "But the money you've already spent is mine to spend as I choose," he interrupted, echoing his earlier words. "And I choose to spend it helping someone who needs it." Clara looked up at him, searching his face for some sign of the hidden agenda she'd been taught to expect from men in positions of power. But Samuel's expression held only genuine concern and kindness. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why are you being so kind to me? You don't even know me." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the darkening sky. "5 years ago, I was working on a ranch in Colorado," he said finally. "The owner was a lot like Aldrich Blackwood, cruel, demanding, treated his workers like property. There was a young Mexican boy named Miguel who worked in the stables. He was maybe 14, sent money home to his family every month." Clara sat on the edge of the bed, sensing the importance of what Samuel was about to share. One day, Miguel accidentally left a gate open and some horses got loose. It took us hours to round them up, and the owner was furious. He beat that boy with a horsewhip until Miguel could barely stand. Samuel's jaw tightened at the memory. "I was just a hired hand, had no authority to stop it. But I should have tried. I should have done something." "What happened to Miguel?" "He died 2 days later. Internal injuries from the beating. The owner claimed it was an accident, that the boy had been kicked by a horse. Samuel's voice was heavy with guilt. I knew the truth, but I was too much of a coward to speak up. I quit the next day and never looked back. Understanding dawned in Clara's eyes. You saved me because you couldn't save him. Partly, Samuel admitted, but mostly because it was the right thing to do. Miguel taught me that staying silent in the face of cruelty makes you complicit in it. I swore I'd never stand by and watch someone suffer if I had the power to stop it. Clara felt tears threatening again. I don't know how to repay you. You don't need to repay me, Samuel said firmly. But if you want to honor what happened today, live your life freely, make your own choices, be happy. The words struck Clara like a physical blow. Happiness was a concept so foreign to her that she couldn't even imagine what it might feel like. For 3 years, she'd focused solely on survival, on avoiding pain and punishment. The idea that she might actually be entitled to joy seemed revolutionary. I don't know how to be happy, she admitted. I don't even know how to be free. Samuel's expression softened. That's okay. You'll learn, and you'll have help. From you, from everyone here. Elena, the ranch hands, the other families. We're not just employees, Clara. We're a community. We look out for each other. As if summoned by his words, Elena appeared in the doorway with fresh linens. How are you feeling, mija? Better, Clara said, and was surprised to realize it was true. The physical pain remained, but the crushing weight of fear and despair that had pressed down on her for years was beginning to lift. Good, Eleanor said, bustling around the room to make Clara more comfortable. Tomorrow we'll start teaching you what freedom looks like, but tonight you rest. After they left, Clara lay in the soft bed, staring up at the ceiling. Through the open window, she could hear the gentle sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. Cattle lowing softly in the distance, the murmur of voices from the workers' quarters, the rustle of wind through the trees. For the first time, in 3 years, Clara fell asleep without fear. No one would wake her before dawn with harsh commands. No one would beat her for being too slow or too clumsy. No one would remind her that she was worthless, that she deserved nothing better than scraps and cruelty. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new uncertainties. She would have to learn how to live as a free woman, how to make choices for herself, rather than simply following orders. The prospect was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. But tonight, wrapped in Elena's kindness and Samuel's protection, Clara Brennan slept the sleep of the truly safe for the first time since her father's death. And in her dreams she began to imagine what happiness might actually feel like. Clara woke to unfamiliar sounds, birds singing outside her window instead of the harsh clang of a bell summoning servants to work. Sunlight streamed through white curtains, and for a disorienting moment she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back, and she sat up carefully, testing her aching body. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, and she could smell coffee brewing and bacon frying somewhere below. Her stomach rumbled, reminding her that she'd eaten little the day before. At the Blackwood estate, breakfast had been stale bread and weak tea, consumed in hurried silence before the day's work began. The thought of sitting down to a proper meal felt like an impossible luxury. Soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Clara?" Elena's voice called. "Are you awake, mija?" "Yes, please come in." Elena entered, carrying a breakfast tray laden with scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, fresh biscuits, and a pot of coffee that smelled like heaven. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in years," Clara admitted, accepting the tray gratefully. "But I should be helping you prepare breakfast, not having it served to me." Elena settled into the chair by the window. "You're recovering from injuries. Rest is part of healing." She studied Clara's face carefully. How are you feeling this morning? Any dizziness? Nausea? Clara shook her head, taking a tentative bite of the eggs. They were perfectly seasoned and cooked just right. Nothing like the tasteless gruel she'd grown accustomed to. Everything tastes incredible. Good food helps the body heal, Eleanor said with satisfaction. Dr. Harrison will want to check on you later, but I think you're already looking stronger. Through the window, Clara could see the ranch coming to life. Workers moved between the buildings with purposeful efficiency, but there was something different about their demeanor compared to the Blackwood servants. These people weren't hunched with fear or moving with the mechanical precision of the terrorized. They called greetings to each other, shared brief conversations, even laughed occasionally. "Elena," Clara said hesitantly, "what exactly do you do here? I mean, what are your duties?" Elena smiled. "I manage the household, keep the books, coordinate with the workers' families, help with medical issues when they arise. Whatever needs doing, really. And Mr. Rivers doesn't mind that you make decisions without asking permission first. Samuel hired me to manage things, not to ask permission for every choice," Elena explained. "He trusts my judgment, and I trust his. That's how partnerships work." The concept was revolutionary to Clara. At the Blackwood estate, every decision had to be approved by Master Blackwood or his wife, no matter how trivial. Servants who showed initiative were accused of overstepping their bounds and punished accordingly. A commotion in the yard below caught their attention. A rider was approaching at full gallop, dust clouds trailing behind his horse. Even from a distance, Clara could see the urgency in the man's posture. Elena frowned, moving to get a better view. "That's Jack Morrison from Hendrick's place. Something's wrong." They watched as Samuel emerged from the barn to meet the rider. Even through the glass, they could see the animated conversation, Samuel's expression growing increasingly grave. After a few minutes, both men hurried toward the house. "Elena!" Samuel's voice carried up the stairs. "We need to talk." Elena squeezed Clara's shoulder. "Finish your breakfast. I'll be back soon." Clara tried to concentrate on her food, but anxiety gnawed at her stomach. The urgency of the rider's arrival reminded her too much of the unpredictable crises that had punctuated life at the Blackwood estate. Just when things seemed calm, something would happen to shatter the peace. 20 minutes later, Elena returned with Samuel close behind. Both looked troubled. "Clara," Samuel said, his voice gentle but serious, "I need to tell you something. Word has spread about what happened yesterday. Aldrich is telling people that you stole from him, that I helped a thief escape justice." Clara's blood ran cold. "But that's not true. I never stole anything." "We know that," Elena said quickly. "But Aldrich has influence in town. He's spreading lies, trying to turn people against Samuel and damage the ranch's reputation." Samuel pulled up another chair, his expression thoughtful. "There's more. He's filed a complaint with Sheriff Garrett, claiming that you damaged valuable property and that I interfered with his legal right to discipline his employee." "Can he do that?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "He can try," Samuel said. Grimly, "Sheriff Garrett is an honest man, but he's also politically minded. Aldrich contributes heavily to his re-election campaigns." Clara felt the familiar weight of despair settling over her. "This is my fault. I should leave. If I'm not here, he can't use me against you." "Absolutely not," Samuel said firmly. "Running away won't solve anything, and it won't keep you safe. Aldrich would just track you down and drag you back." "Then what do we do?" Samuel exchanged a look with Eleanor. "We fight back, but not the way Aldrich expects." Before Clara could ask what he meant, another knock sounded at the front door. This time, the visitor was Dr. Harrison, accompanied by a woman Clara didn't recognize. "This is Margaret Sinclair," Dr. Harrison explained as Elena brought them upstairs. "She's the territory's legal advocate for worker protection cases. Margaret Sinclair was a woman in her 30s with intelligent brown eyes and prematurely grey hair pulled back in a severe bun. She carried a leather satchel and had the bearing of someone accustomed to fighting uphill battles. "Miss Brennan," she said, settling into a chair, "Dr. Harrison has told me about your situation. I'd like to hear your side of the story, in your own words." Clara glanced nervously at Samuel and Elena. "I don't understand. What kind of legal advocate?" "I work for the Territorial Bureau of Labor Relations," Margaret explained. "We investigate cases of worker abuse and exploitation. What happened to you yesterday wasn't just morally wrong. It violated several territorial statutes regarding the treatment of indentured workers." "Indentured workers have rights?" Clara asked in amazement. Margaret's expression hardened. "More rights than most. Employers want to acknowledge. The law is clear. Physical punishment for minor infractions is prohibited. Workers must be provided adequate food and shelter, and contracts cannot be enforced through violence." Over the next hour, Clara told her story. Margaret took detailed notes, asking pointed questions about the conditions at the Blackwood estate, the treatment of other servants, and the specific circumstances of the previous day's beating. "Miss Brennan," Margaret said finally, "would you be willing to testify about these experiences in a formal hearing?" Clara's stomach clenched. "You mean in front of Master Blackwood? In court? In front of a territorial magistrate?" "Yes. And yes, Mr. Blackwood would be there, along with his lawyers." The thought terrified Clara. She could imagine Aldrich Blackwood's rage at being publicly accused, his desire for revenge. "What would happen if I refused?" "Nothing," Margaret said honestly. "But if you agree to testify, we have a real chance of not only clearing your name, but also protecting other workers in similar situations." Samuel leaned forward. "Clara, the choice is entirely yours. No one will think less of you if you decide it's too risky." But Elena spoke up, her voice firm. "How many other girls are still at that estate, Mija? How many more are working for other employers just like Blackwood?" The question hit Clara like a physical blow. She thought of Maria Santos in the kitchen, of the two girls who shared her cramped basement room, of all the workers who lived in constant fear of their employer's temper. "If I testify," Clara said slowly, "what happens to Mr. Rivers? Aldrich Blackwood is powerful. He could destroy the ranch." Margaret exchanged a glance with Samuel. "Actually, that's where things get interesting. We've been building a case against several large employers in this territory for months. Mr. Blackwood's complaint against you yesterday, it might have just given us the legal opening we needed." She opened her satchel and pulled out a thick folder. "We have documented complaints against the Blackwood estate going back 3 years. Workers who died under suspicious circumstances, families driven into debt by inflated charges for room and board, evidence of wage theft and contract manipulation." Clara stared at the folder. "Other people tried to speak out. A few brave souls." "Yes, but they were individual complaints, easy to dismiss or cover up. Your case is different because Samuel's intervention created witnesses, because Dr. Harrison documented your injuries, and because Mr. Blackwood's own public statements about the incident can be used against him." Samuel stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "Margaret, what are the real chances of success with Clara's testimony? Better than 50-50. Without it, we're looking at another case that gets buried in paperwork and political maneuvering." The room fell silent as everyone waited for Clara's decision. She could feel the weight of their expectations, but more than that, she could feel the weight of responsibility for all the workers still trapped in situations like the one she'd escaped. "There's something else you should know," Dr. Harrison said quietly. I examined 3 other workers from various estates in the past month. All showed signs of malnutrition and physical abuse. This isn't just about you, Miss Brennan. It's about a pattern of systematic exploitation. Clara closed her eyes, trying to summon courage she wasn't sure she possessed. The thought of facing Aldrich Blackwood in court made her feel sick with terror. But the thought of other young women enduring what she'd endured was even worse. "If I testify," she said finally, "what happens afterward? Where do I go? What do I do?" "That's up to you," Samuel said, turning from the window. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you want, with no obligations or expectations. Or Elena knows people in other territories who might offer opportunities. You have choices now, Clara. Real choices." Margaret added, "If our case is successful, there will likely be financial settlements. You wouldn't be wealthy, but you'd have enough to start fresh wherever you choose." Clara thought about the basement room she'd shared, the 16-hour workdays, the constant fear of saying or doing the wrong thing. Then she thought about Miguel, the boy Samuel had told her about, who had died because no one was brave enough to speak the truth. "I'll do it," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'll testify." Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile Clara had seen from her. "Good. We'll need to prepare extensively. Mr. Blackwood will have expensive lawyers who will try to discredit you, to make you seem unreliable or dishonest." "What do you mean?" "They'll question your character, your motives, your memory of events. They'll try to paint you as an ungrateful servant who's lying for revenge or money." Margaret's expression was serious. "It won't be pleasant, Clara." "Ah, you sure you're ready for that?" Clara thought about Elena's story, about Samuel's quiet courage in buying her freedom, about all the workers still trapped in situations like hers. "I'm ready." Over the next several days, Clara's world expanded in ways she'd never imagined. Margaret visited daily, helping her prepare testimony and explaining the legal process. Samuel introduced her to the ranch hands and their families, people who welcomed her with the same warmth they showed each other. She met Tom and Lucy Garrett, who managed the cattle operations. Their 3 children treated Clara like a beloved aunt. There was Roberto Silva, the horse trainer, who spoke in a mixture of English and Spanish that somehow made perfect sense. Old Pete Williams, the ranch's retired foreman, regaled her with stories of the territory's early days while teaching her to play checkers. Most surprising was her growing friendship with Annie Foster, a young woman about Clara's age whose family had worked for Samuel for 2 years. Annie had been born into poverty but had learned to read and write with Samuel's encouragement. She was currently saving money to attend a teacher's college in the territorial capital. "The difference between here and other places," Annie explained as they walked through the ranch's vegetable garden, "is that Samuel sees potential in people instead of just labor. He doesn't just give you work, he gives you hope." Clara found herself thinking about her own potential for the first time in years. What did she want to do with her life? What dreams had she abandoned when her father died and she'd been forced into servitude? "Annie," she said hesitantly, "do you think it's too late for someone like me to learn new skills, to become something more than a servant?" Annie stopped, walking, and turned to face her. "Clara, you're 20 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you. Of course it's not too late. But I don't have any education. I can barely read. Elena taught me to read when I first came here," Annie said. "She could teach you too if you want." The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Education had always seemed like something for wealthy people, not for girls from poor families who needed to work to survive. That evening, Clara found the courage to approach Elena about lessons. Elena's face lit up with enthusiasm. "Of course, Mija. We'll start tomorrow morning. You'll be reading books before you know it." As Clara prepared for bed that night, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few days. She was no longer just surviving. She was beginning to live. The terror of the upcoming court case remained, but it was balanced by a growing sense of purpose and possibility. Standing at her bedroom window, she looked out over the ranch that had become her sanctuary. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, and continued preparation for the legal battle ahead. But tonight, Clara Brennan was exactly where she belonged, free, safe, and surrounded by people who believed in her worth as a human being. The girl who had cowered on the Blackwood dining room floor was still part of her, but she was no longer the whole story. Clara was becoming someone new, someone stronger, someone who could face Aldrich Blackwood in court and tell the truth without flinching. The transformation wasn't complete yet, but it had begun. And that was enough for now. 3 weeks had passed since Clara's arrival at Riverbend Ranch, and the territorial courthouse in Cedar Falls bustled with unusual activity. Word of the Blackwood case had spread throughout the territory, drawing spectators, journalists, and curious onlookers from neighboring counties. The morning air crackled with tension as carriages and horses crowded the courthouse square. Clara sat in a small anteroom adjacent to the main courtroom, her hands trembling, despite Elena's steadying presence beside her. Through the thin walls, she could hear the murmur of voices as the gallery filled. Margaret Sinclair had warned her that the case would attract attention, but the reality was overwhelming. "Remember," Margaret said, reviewing her notes one final time. "Answer only what you're asked. Don't volunteer extra information. If you don't understand a question, ask for clarification." And Clara, she looked up with serious eyes. "Tell the truth, even when it's painful, especially when it's painful." Samuel knocked softly and entered, carrying a cup of chamomile tea. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified," Clara admitted, accepting the warm cup gratefully. "What if I forget something important? What if I say the wrong thing?" "You're going to be fine," Eleanor said firmly. "You know what happened to you. No one can change that truth, no matter how hard they try." Through the window, Clara could see a familiar black carriage pulling up to the courthouse. Her stomach lurched as Aldrich Blackwood stepped out, resplendent in an expensive suit and silk top hat. Behind him emerged his wife Constance, and a man Clara didn't recognize, presumably one of his high-priced lawyers from the territorial capital. Even from a distance, Blackwood's presence commanded attention. He moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way, nodding to supporters and speaking briefly with reporters. Clara noticed how people stepped aside to let him pass, their deference automatic and complete. "He looks so powerful," Clara whispered. "Power built on fear isn't real power," Samuel said quietly. "Real power comes from justice, from truth, and today the truth gets its day in court." Magistrate William Thornton called the proceedings to order at precisely 10 o'clock. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and crowding near the windows. Clara had never seen so many faces turned toward a single focal point, all waiting to hear her story. Blackwood's lead attorney, Harrison Whitmore, was a silver-haired man with cold blue eyes and a reputation for destroying witnesses on cross-examination. He'd traveled from the territorial capital specifically for this case, and his presence alone demonstrated how seriously the Blackwood family was taking the charges. Margaret began with her opening statement, painting a picture of systematic abuse and exploitation that extended far beyond Clara's individual experience. She spoke of the broader pattern of worker mistreatment, the culture of fear that pervaded estates throughout the territory, and the urgent need for justice. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, "this case is about more than one young woman's suffering. It's about whether we, as a civilized society, will tolerate the systematic brutalization of our most vulnerable citizens." Whitmore's opening statement was a masterclass in misdirection. He portrayed Clara as an ungrateful servant who had fabricated her story to escape legitimate consequences for theft and destruction of property. He painted Samuel as a naive do-gooder whose interference had prevented proper justice and suggested that the entire case was a politically motivated attack on successful businessmen. "Mr. Blackwood," Whitmore declared, "is a pillar of this community, a job creator who has provided opportunities for hundreds of workers over the years. He is being persecuted for the simple act of maintaining discipline in his household, discipline that was both necessary and legally justified." When Clara's name was called, her legs felt like water. The walk from the anteroom to the witness stand seemed to take forever, with hundreds of eyes tracking her movement. She could feel Blackwood's gaze boring into her, cold and predatory. Magistrate. Thornton was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a reputation for fairness. "Please state your name for the record," he said gently. "Clara Elizabeth Brennan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please speak up, Miss Brennan. The court needs to hear your testimony clearly." Clara cleared her throat and tried again. "Clara Elizabeth Brennan." Margaret approached the witness stand with careful, measured steps. "Miss Brennan, please tell the court about your employment at the Blackwood estate." For the next hour, Clara recounted her story. She described the death of her father, her family's desperate financial situation, and the contract that had bound her to 3 years of service. She spoke of the basement room, the 16-hour workdays, the constant fear that permeated every aspect of life at the estate. "Did you ever witness other workers being physically punished?" Margaret asked. "Yes," Clara said, her voice growing stronger as she found her rhythm. "Cook Maria was beaten with a wooden spoon for oversalting soup. One of the stable boys was whipped for letting a horse get loose. The punishments happened regularly." "Please, describe the events of Tuesday, March 15th, the day you dropped Master Blackwood's plate." Clara closed her eyes briefly, then opened them and looked directly at the magistrate. She described the morning in detail, the argument in the kitchen, her distraction, the moment the plate slipped from her fingers. Her voice remained steady as she recounted Blackwood's rage and the beating that followed. "He used his cane," she said, demonstrating the motion. "He struck me across the shoulders, my back, my arms. He said I was worthless, that I didn't deserve to eat. He was going to deny me food for 3 days. What happened next? Mr. Rivers arrived. He told Master Blackwood to stop, said that mistakes don't deserve pain." Clara's voice softened with gratitude. "He offered to pay my debt, to buy my freedom." Margaret nodded. "How much was your family's debt to Mr. Blackwood?" "He claimed it was $1,200, including interest and penalties." A murmur ran through the courtroom. $1,200 was an enormous sum, more than most workers earned in several years. "Did you steal this plate, Miss Brennan?" "No, I did not. It was an accident." "Had you ever stolen anything from the Blackwood estate?" "No, never." Margaret concluded her direct examination, and Clara braced herself for what everyone knew would come next. Harrison Whitmore approached the witness stand like a predator circling wounded prey. "Miss Brennan," he began, his voice smooth and dangerous, "you've painted quite a picture of yourself as an innocent victim. But let's examine the facts, shall we?" For the next 2 hours, Whitmore subjected Clara to a relentless cross-examination designed to destroy her credibility. He questioned her memory, her motives, her character. He suggested she was lying for money, for revenge, for attention. "Isn't it true, Miss Brennan, that you had been planning to leave the Blackwood estate for months?" "No, that's not true." "Isn't it true that you deliberately broke that plate to create a dramatic scene?" "Absolutely not." "Isn't it true that you had been stealing small items from the estate and selling them in town?" "No, I never stole anything." Whitmore produced a ledger, claiming it showed discrepancies in household inventory that coincided with Clara's employment. Margaret objected repeatedly, pointing out that the ledger had no verified connection to Clara, but the damage was done. Doubt had been planted in some minds. "Miss Brennan," Whitmore continued, "how much money did Mr. Rivers promise you for testifying today?" "He didn't promise me anything." "Come now, surely a man doesn't pay $1,200 for a stranger without expecting something in return." Clara felt heat rising in her cheeks. "Mr. Rivers helped me because it was the right thing to do. He didn't ask for anything." "How convenient. And I suppose you expect this court to believe that you're testifying purely out of civic duty?" "I'm testifying because what happened to me was wrong, and it's still happening to other people." Whitmore's expression became openly contemptuous. "Other people? Or do you mean other lying servants who think they can profit from false accusations?" Margaret shot to her feet. "Objection! Counsel is badgering the witness." "Sustained," Magistrate Thornton ruled. "Mr. Whitmore, please confine yourself to proper questioning." But Whitmore had achieved his goal. He'd painted Clara as a mercenary liar, motivated by greed rather than justice. As she left the witness stand, Clara felt drained and humiliated, certain that she'd failed to convince anyone of the truth. During the lunch recess, Margaret found Clara crying in the anteroom. "I ruined everything," Clara sobbed. "He made me sound like a liar and a thief." "No, you didn't ruin anything," Margaret said firmly. "Whitmore's tactics were predictable. He can't change what actually happened to you, so he's trying to make the jury doubt your character. But we have more witnesses, more evidence." The afternoon brought Dr. Harrison to the stand, his medical testimony providing clinical support for Clara's account of her injuries. Roberto Silva testified about the culture of fear at neighboring estates. Margaret even called several former Blackwood workers who had managed to escape their contracts, each telling similar stories of abuse and exploitation. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. As the day was winding down, a commotion arose in the gallery. A young man in work clothes was pushing through the crowd, calling out, "I need to testify. I have to tell the truth." Magistrate Thornton called for order as the young man approached the bench. "Your Honor, my name is David Chen. I work at the Blackwood estate, and I saw what happened to Miss Brennan. I saw everything." Margaret and Whitmore both requested immediate conferences with the magistrate. After 20 minutes of heated discussion, Thornton ruled that David could testify as a rebuttal witness. David Chen was perhaps 19, with calloused hands and nervous eyes. He worked in the Blackwood stables and had been employed there for 2 years. His testimony was devastating to Blackwood's case. "I was cleaning tack in the room next to the dining room," David said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I heard the plate break," heard Master Blackwood shouting. "I looked through the service door and saw him beating Miss Clara with his cane." "What exactly did you see?" Margaret asked. "He hit her maybe 15, 20 times. She was on the ground trying to protect herself. He was calling her names, saying she was worthless." David's voice broke. "When Mr. Rivers came in and stopped it, I thought maybe someone finally had the courage to stand up to him." Whitmore tried to discredit David on cross-examination, suggesting he was lying to protect his job prospects. But David's testimony had the ring of truth, and his obvious terror at testifying against his employer only made him more credible. "Are you afraid of what might happen to you for testifying today?" Margaret asked on redirect. "Yes," David admitted. "Master Blackwood will probably fire me, maybe worse, but I couldn't stay quiet anymore. What he did to Miss Clara was wrong, and somebody needed to say so." As the court day ended, Clara felt a mixture of exhaustion and hope. David's courage in coming forward had transformed the case, providing independent corroboration of her account. But she knew the real test would come tomorrow when Aldrich Blackwood himself took the stand. That evening, back at Riverbend Ranch, the household gathered for dinner with unusual solemnity. Clara picked at her food, her mind replaying every moment of the day's testimony. "You did well today," Samuel said quietly. "I know it was difficult, but you told the truth with dignity." "David Chen risked everything to support you," Elena added. "That says something about the kind of person you are, Miha. People don't put themselves in danger for someone they don't believe in." Clara looked around the table at the faces of people who had become her family. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever the magistrate decided, she was no longer the terrified girl who had cowered on the Blackwood dining room floor. She was Clara Brennan, and she had found her voice. Tomorrow, Aldrich, Blackwood would have his chance to tell his version of events. But tonight, Clara slept peacefully, knowing that she had spoken the truth and that the truth, whatever its consequences, was always worth defending. The second day of the trial dawned grey and overcast, matching the somber mood that had settled. Over Cedar Falls, news of David Chen's testimony had spread through the territory overnight, and an even larger crowd gathered outside the courthouse. Clara noticed the changed atmosphere immediately. Where yesterday's crowd had been curious and divided, today's spectators seemed unified in their anticipation of justice. Inside the courthouse, Aldrich Blackwood sat ramrod straight at the defendant's table, his expensive suit impeccable despite the circumstances. But Clara, who had learned to read the subtle signs of his moods during her years of servitude, could see the cracks in his composure. His jaw was clenched tighter than usual, and his hands gripped his cane with white-knuckled intensity. Harrison. Whitmore called his first witness, Theodore Blackwood, Aldrich's son, who had returned from university specifically to testify on his father's behalf. Theodore was 25. Tall and handsome in the way that money could polish, but there was something weak about his chin and uncertain about his eyes. "Mr. Blackwood," Whitmore began, "how would you characterize your father's treatment of the workers on your family estate?" "Fair and just," Theodore replied, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of privilege. "My father provides employment for dozens of families. He's always been firm but reasonable in his expectations. Have you ever witnessed your father physically assault a worker?" "Never. My father believes in discipline, but he's not a violent man." Margaret's cross-examination was swift and surgical. "Mr. Blackwood, when was the last time you spent more than a weekend at the family estate?" Theodore shifted uncomfortably. "Well, I've been at university for the past 4 years. So you haven't actually witnessed your father's day-to-day interactions with workers recently?" "Not recently, no, but thank you, no further questions." The brevity of Margaret's cross-examination spoke volumes. Theodore's testimony carried little weight since he hadn't been present to witness anything relevant to the case. Whitmore then called a parade of character witnesses, businessmen from town who spoke glowingly of Aldrich Blackwood's contributions to the community, his charitable donations, his role in local economic development. Each painted a picture of a respected citizen who couldn't possibly be guilty of the charges against him. But Margaret's cross-examinations revealed the hollow nature of their testimonials. None had ever visited the estate's worker quarters. None had first-hand knowledge of how Blackwood treated his employees. Their testimony was based on public persona rather than private behavior. The tension in the courtroom reached its peak when Magistrate Thornton called for the day's final witness. "The court calls Aldrich Blackwood." A hush fell over the packed gallery as Blackwood rose from his seat. Even approaching 60, he cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair and the bearing of a man accustomed to command. He moved to the witness stand with deliberate dignity, his every gesture calculated to project authority and respectability. Whitmore's direct examination was a masterclass in image rehabilitation. Blackwood spoke eloquently about his family's 3 generations of service to the territory, their role in developing the local economy, their commitment to providing employment opportunities for those less fortunate. "Mr. Blackwood," Whitmore asked, "please tell the court about your relationship with your workers." I've always prided myself on being a fair but firm employer, Blackwood replied, his voice resonating with practiced sincerity. The people who work for me are provided with housing, food, medical care when needed, and steady employment. In return, I expect competence and reliability. Do you recall the incident involving Miss Brennan and the broken plate? Blackwood's expression grew, appropriately grave. I do. It was deeply disappointing. The plate she destroyed was a family heirloom, irreplaceable. More concerning was her attitude. She showed no remorse, no understanding of the value of what she had broken. Clara felt her stomach clench. Even under oath, Blackwood was twisting the truth, making her sound callous and ungrateful. How did you respond to this incident? I spoke to her sternly about the importance of careful handling of valuable items. I may have raised my voice. I was frustrated by her carelessness, but I certainly never laid a hand on her. Never, never. The suggestion that I would beat a young woman with a cane is preposterous and deeply offensive. Whitmore nodded sympathetically. What about the claims regarding poor working conditions at your estate? Completely false, Blackwood said firmly. My workers are provided with clean quarters, adequate food, and fair treatment. The accusations being made are the fantasies of disgruntled former employees seeking financial compensation. When Whitmore finished his direct examination, the courtroom was quiet. Blackwood had presented himself as a pillar of the community being persecuted by ungrateful workers and outside agitators. His performance was polished, confident, and utterly convincing to anyone who didn't know the truth. Margaret Sinclair rose for cross-examination with the predatory grace of a hunter who had finally cornered her prey. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and Clara could see the steel in her eyes. Mr. Blackwood, Margaret began conversationally, you testified that you provide medical care for your workers when needed. Who is the doctor you typically call for worker injuries? Blackwood hesitated. We handle minor injuries ourselves. For serious matters, Dr. Harrison has been called upon occasion. How often would you say Dr. Harrison has been called to treat injured workers at your estate? I couldn't say exactly. Not often. Margaret consulted her notes. Dr. Harrison's records show he's been called to your estate 17 times in the past 3 years to treat worker injuries. Does that seem consistent with your testimony about providing a safe workplace? Whitmore objected, but Magistrate Thornton allowed the question. Blackwood's composure slipped slightly. Some people are naturally accident-prone. Accident-prone, Margaret repeated. Is that how you would describe Maria Santos, your cook, who Dr. Harrison treated for a broken wrist last year? I wouldn't know the specifics of... What about James? Muller, a stable hand who was treated for severe bruising to his back and shoulders? Blackwood's jaw tightened. I don't recall every minor incident that occurs on a working ranch. Margaret moved closer to the witness stand. Mr. Blackwood, you testified that you never laid a hand on Miss Brennan. Are you familiar with the legal definition of perjury? Of course I am, Blackwood snapped, his careful composure cracking, and I resent the implication. You also testified that Miss Brennan showed no remorse for breaking the plate, but according to multiple witnesses, she immediately apologized and began cleaning up the broken pieces. Were you mistaken about her response? She may have made some perfunctory apology, but her attitude was defiant. Defiant? A young woman on her hands and knees, bleeding from trying to clean up broken china, struck you as defiant? Blackwood's face was reddening. She was careless with valuable property. Discipline was required. What form did this discipline take? I spoke to her firmly about her responsibilities. Margaret pulled out a photograph, a medical documentation of Clara's injuries taken by Dr. Harrison. Your Honor, I'd like to enter this as evidence. Mr. Blackwood, do these injuries look like the result of someone being spoken to firmly? Blackwood barely glanced at the photograph. I have no idea how she acquired those injuries, probably from her own clumsiness. So your testimony is that Miss Brennan somehow inflicted these extensive bruises and welts on her own back and shoulders. I have no idea how she got them. All I know is that I didn't cause them. Margaret's voice grew deadly quiet. Mr. Blackwood, are you aware that David Chen, one of your current employees, testified yesterday that he witnessed you beating Miss Brennan with your cane? David Chen is a liar, Blackwood snarled, his mask of respectability finally slipping completely. He's probably been put up to this by Rivers and his money. So, Mr. Chen is lying. Dr. Harrison fabricated the medical evidence. Miss Brennan injured herself, and this entire case is an elaborate conspiracy against you? That's exactly what it is, Blackwood's voice echoed through the courtroom. Samuel, Rivers wants my land, and he's using this girl to destroy my reputation. The outburst hung in the air like smoke. Margaret had successfully goaded Blackwood into revealing his true nature, not the benevolent employer he'd portrayed, but an angry, paranoid man who saw himself as the victim of vast conspiracies. No further questions, Margaret said quietly, returning to her seat. Whitmore attempted damage control on redirect examination, but the harm was done. Blackwood's credibility had been shattered by his own words. The jury had seen behind the mask of respectability to the cruel reality beneath. As the testimony phase concluded, both sides prepared for closing arguments. Clara felt emotionally drained, but oddly hopeful. The truth had finally been spoken, in open court, witnessed by hundreds of people who could no longer claim ignorance about what really happened on estates like Blackwood's. During the evening recess, Margaret met with Clara and Samuel at a nearby restaurant. "How do you think it went?" Clara asked nervously. "Better than I hoped," Margaret admitted. "Blackwood's outburst damaged his case significantly, but juries can be unpredictable, especially when powerful men are involved." Samuel leaned forward. "What happens if we lose?" "If we lose, Blackwood walks away with his reputation intact, and the broader investigation into worker abuse gets much more difficult," Margaret said honestly. "But if we win, it opens the door to prosecuting other employers throughout the territory." Clara stared out the restaurant window at the courthouse across the square. "What happens to me either way?" "Either way, you're free," Samuel said firmly. "The money I paid for your debt was legally binding. Blackwood can never force you back into servitude. But if we lose, people will think I'm a liar," Clara said quietly. "Some people will think that regardless," Margaret said. "But Clara, what you've done here, speaking truth to power, risking everything to protect other workers, that takes extraordinary courage. Win or lose, you've already accomplished something remarkable." That night, Clara lay awake thinking about the workers, still trapped at the Blackwood estate and others like it throughout the territory. Maria Santos, still cooking in that kitchen where she'd been beaten. The stable hands, the housemaids, the field workers, all living in fear because they had no alternative. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments, and then the magistrate's decision. Clara had done everything she could to ensure justice was served. Now, she could only wait and hope that the truth was powerful enough to overcome wealth, influence, and the ingrained prejudices that protected men like Aldrich Blackwood. As dawn approached, Clara made a silent promise to herself. Regardless of the trial's outcome, she would use her freedom to help others find theirs. She would learn to read and write, develop skills, and build a life dedicated to ensuring that no one else would have to endure what she had survived. The scared servant girl who had dropped a plate 3 weeks ago was gone forever. In her place stood Clara Brennan, witness, survivor, and advocate for justice. Tomorrow would determine whether the legal system would stand with her or against her, but Clara had already won the most important victory of all. She had reclaimed her voice and her dignity. The trial was nearly over, but Clara's real journey toward freedom and purpose was just beginning. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it not as a victim, but as a woman who had learned that mistakes don't deserve pain, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply tell the truth. The final day of the trial arrived, with an electric tension that seemed to charge the very air around the courthouse. By 7 in the morning, people were already gathering outside, some having traveled from distant counties to witness what many believed would be a watershed moment for worker rights in the territory. Clara noticed faces in the crowd she recognized, other servants, ranch hands, and laborers who had taken enormous risks just to be present for the verdict. Inside the courthouse, Margaret Sinclair stood before the packed gallery to deliver her closing argument. She had spent the previous evening carefully crafting her words, knowing this might be her only chance to fundamentally change how the territory's legal system viewed worker protection. "Members of the jury," Margaret began, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent courtroom, "over the past 2 days, you have heard 2 very different versions of what happened on March 15th. One version tells of a young woman so inherently clumsy and worthless that she deserved to be beaten for an honest mistake. The other tells of systematic cruelty disguised as legitimate discipline." She moved closer to the jury box, making eye contact with each member. "The evidence before you is overwhelming. Dr. Harrison's medical documentation shows injuries consistent with a severe beating. David Chen, at great personal risk, corroborated Miss Brennan's account. Most telling of all, you witnessed Mr. Blackwood's true character when he lost his composure on this very stand." Margaret paused, letting her words sink in. "But this case is about more than one man's cruelty or one woman's suffering. It's about the kind of society we choose to be. Do we accept that wealth and power place a person above the law? Do we believe that some human beings exist solely for the convenience of others?" Clara watched the jury's faces, trying to read their expressions. The 12 men came from various backgrounds, farmers, merchants, craftsmen, but all were property owners. All had a stake in maintaining the social order that protected their interests. "Mr. Blackwood would have you believe that Clara Brennan is a lying opportunist seeking undeserved profit," Margaret continued. "But ask yourselves, what has she gained from coming forward? She's endured public humiliation, character assassination, and threats to her safety. No rational person would subject themselves to such an ordeal for money they're unlikely to receive." She gestured toward Clara, who sat with quiet dignity in the gallery. Miss Brennan testified not for personal gain, but because she understood that silence enables abuse. She spoke for every worker who lives in fear, every person trapped in circumstances beyond their control, every soul who believes they deserve basic human dignity. Margaret's voice grew stronger. "The defense wants you to believe that this case threatens the natural order, that holding employers accountable will somehow destroy our economy, but I submit that the opposite is true. A society that protects its most vulnerable members is stronger, more prosperous, and more just than one that sacrifices them for the convenience of the powerful." She moved back toward her table, her final words ringing through the courthouse. "You have the power to send a message that will echo throughout this territory and beyond. You can declare that no person, regardless of their station, is above the law. You can affirm that in our society, mistakes don't deserve pain. The choice is yours." Harrison Whitmore's closing argument was a masterful appeal to class solidarity and economic anxiety. He painted the case as an attack on property rights and the natural hierarchy that kept society functioning. He warned that convicting Blackwood would embolden ungrateful workers to fabricate claims against honest employers. "Gentlemen of the jury," Whitmore concluded, "Mr. Blackwood stands before you as a successful businessman being persecuted for maintaining necessary discipline in his workplace. If you convict him based on the uncorroborated claims of a disgruntled former employee, you set a dangerous precedent that will destabilize our entire economic system. Magistrate Thornton's instructions to the jury were careful and thorough. He explained the relevant laws, the burden of proof, and the standards they must apply in reaching their verdict. At 11:30 in the morning, the 12 men filed out to begin their deliberations. The waiting was agony. Clara, Samuel, and Elena retreated to a nearby cafe, but none could manage more than picking at their food. Margaret joined them briefly, her usual confidence replaced by nervous energy. "How long do jury deliberations usually take?" Clara asked. "It varies," Margaret replied. "A quick verdict could go either way. Either they're convinced of Blackwood's guilt, or they dismiss the charges outright. A longer deliberation might mean they're taking the evidence seriously." Hours passed with excruciating slowness. Clara found herself thinking about her life before all this began. The basement room, the constant fear, the crushing certainty that she would never be anything more than someone else's property. Whatever the verdict, that life was gone forever. At 4 o'clock, word came that the jury had reached a decision. The courthouse filled again as people rushed back from their afternoon activities. Clara's hands trembled as she took her seat, Samuel and Elena flanking her like protective guardians. The jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces carefully neutral. Clara tried to read their expressions, but found no clues about their decision. Foreman Jack Morrison, a local merchant Clara recognized from town, held a folded piece of paper in his weathered hands. "Have you reached a verdict?" Magistrate Thornton asked. "We have, Your Honor. Please read your verdict." Morrison unfolded the paper with deliberate care. The courthouse was so quiet that Clara could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. "We, the jury, find the defendant Aldrich Blackwood guilty of assault upon Clara Brennan and guilty of violating territorial statutes regarding the treatment of indentured workers." The courthouse erupted. Spectators cheered, shouted, and wept. Clara felt the world spinning around her as the reality of the verdict sank in. They had believed her. Justice had been served. Magistrate Thornton banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. When the noise finally subsided, he turned to address Blackwood, who sat stone-faced at the defendant's table. "Mr. Blackwood, you have been found guilty of serious crimes that strike at the heart of human dignity. While the law limits the penalties I can impose, I want to ensure that justice is both served and seen to be served." He consulted his notes before continuing. "I hereby sentence you to 6 months in the territorial prison, sentence suspended pending 2 years of supervised probation. You will pay restitution to Miss Brennan in the amount of $5,000. Additionally, your estate will be subject to monthly inspections by territorial labor officials to ensure compliance with worker protection statutes." The financial penalty was enormous, more than 4 times what Blackwood had claimed Clara's family owed him. But more important than the money was the symbolic victory. A powerful man had been held accountable for his cruelty. "Furthermore," Magistrate Thornton continued, "this case has revealed systematic patterns of abuse that demand broader investigation. I am recommending that territorial authorities conduct comprehensive reviews of working conditions throughout this region." As the court session concluded, Clara found herself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. Workers from various estates approached to thank her for her courage. Several young women, tears streaming down their faces, told her that her testimony had given them hope that their own situations might improve. David Chen appeared at her side, his face beaming despite the uncertainty of his own future. "Thank you," he said simply. "You gave me the courage to speak up." "What will you do now?" Clara asked, concerned about his employment prospects. "Mr. Rivers has offered me a job at his ranch," David said, glancing gratefully at Samuel. says he needs someone who's not afraid to stand up for what's right. Outside the courthouse, Margaret gathered the legal team for a brief celebration. This verdict will have implications far beyond this single case, she explained to Clara. Other workers will be emboldened to come forward. Employers will know they're being watched. You've started something important here, but the most meaningful moment came when a group of Blackwood's current workers approached Clara as she prepared to leave. Maria Santos, the cook who had suffered her own share of abuse, spoke for the group. "Miss Clara," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "we wanted to thank you. Things are already changing at the estate. Master Blackwood is different now, quieter, more careful. Your courage protected all of us." The carriage ride back to Riverbend Ranch was subdued despite the victory. Clara stared out at the familiar landscape, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. She was no longer just a survivor. She had become a catalyst for change. "What happens now?" she asked Samuel as they approached the ranch. "Now you get to decide what kind of life you want to build," he replied. "You have money, freedom, and skills you're still discovering. The world is open to you in ways it never was before." Clara thought about this as they pulled into the ranch yard. Over the past month, she had begun to glimpse possibilities she'd never dared imagine. Elena's reading lessons had opened entire worlds of knowledge and literature. Her friendships with Annie Foster and the other ranch families had shown her what genuine community looked like. Most importantly, she had discovered that she possessed reserves of strength and courage she never knew existed. "I want to help other people like me," she said finally. "People trapped in situations they can't escape alone." Samuel smiled. "I thought you might say that." Margaret mentioned that the territorial government is looking to hire advocates to work with the new labor inspection program. Interested? The idea sent a thrill of excitement through Clara. They would hire someone like me? They would hire someone exactly like you, Elena said firmly. Someone who understands what workers face, someone who can't be intimidated or bought off. 6 months later, Clara stood in the main street of Cedar Falls, wearing a simple but professional dress and carrying a leather satchel filled with legal documents. She was no longer Clara Brennan the servant, or even Clara Brennan the victim. She was Clara Brennan, territorial labor advocate, and she had an appointment to inspect working conditions at a ranch where workers had filed complaints. The transformation hadn't been easy. Learning to read fluently required hours of study every evening. Understanding legal procedures and worker rights had meant memorizing thick manuals and attending training sessions in the territorial capital. Most challenging of all had been learning to see herself as someone worthy of respect and authority, but the work was exactly what Clara had hoped it would be. In her first 6 months, she had investigated dozens of complaints, helped prosecute 3 employers for worker abuse, and assisted in the creation of new regulations that protected indentured workers throughout the territory. Each case reminded her of her own journey from powerlessness to agency. The ranch she was visiting today was owned by a man named Henderson, who had a reputation for treating his workers harshly. As Clara approached the main house, she felt this familiar mixture of nervousness and determination that accompanied these inspections. She thought about Samuel's words from that first day. "Mistakes don't deserve pain." Those words had become her guiding principle, not just in her work, but in how she approached life itself. Everyone deserves compassion, second chances, and the opportunity to grow beyond their mistakes. The scared young woman who had dropped a plate had learned that lesson the hard way, but she had learned it thoroughly. Clara knocked on Henderson's door, ready to ensure that the workers on his ranch received the protection and dignity that every human being deserved. Behind her, the sun was setting over the vast territory she now served, painting the sky in brilliant shades of hope and possibility. The girl who had once believed she was worthless had discovered her true value. The servant who had lived in fear had found her courage. The victim had become an advocate for justice. And somewhere in the distance, at Riverbend Ranch, Samuel Rivers was probably telling someone new that mistakes don't deserve pain. Because sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest acts of kindness. Clara Brennan had learned that freedom wasn't just about escaping cruelty. It was about using that freedom to ensure others could escape as well. And in that moment, standing on the threshold of another fight for justice, she had never felt more alive or more certain of her purpose in the world. 2 years had passed since the trial that changed Clara Brennan's life, and the autumn of 1887 found her standing before the newly constructed Territorial Workers' Rights Commission building in the capital city of Millfield. The 3-story brick structure represented something that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier, a government agency dedicated solely to protecting the rights of working people. Clara adjusted her dark blue coat and checked the watch that Samuel had given her for her 23rd birthday. She was no longer the labor advocate working alone on horseback, traveling from ranch to ranch with nothing but determination and a leather satchel. Today, she held the title of Regional Director for Worker Protection, overseeing a staff of 12 investigators and legal advocates who covered 4 counties. The transformation of the territory's labor landscape had been swift and dramatic. The Blackwood case had opened floodgates that powerful interests had tried desperately to close. Within 6 months of the verdict, over 200 formal complaints had been filed against various employers. The territorial legislature, facing mounting public pressure, had passed the Worker Protection Act of 1887, the most comprehensive labor rights legislation in the Western Territories. Clara's morning began with a staff meeting in the Commission's main conference room. Around the polished oak table sat the team she had helped assemble, former ranch hands who understood working conditions firsthand, educated women who had been excluded from other professional opportunities, and idealistic young lawyers drawn to the cause of social justice. The Henderson Ranch follow-up report shows significant improvements, announced Jessica Walsh, a sharp-minded investigator who had joined the commission 6 months earlier. Living quarters have been upgraded, working hours reduced to 10 per day, and wages increased by 30%. What about the complaints from the Riverside mining operation? Clara asked, reviewing her notes. More complex, replied Thomas Grant, their senior legal counsel. The company is claiming that territorial law doesn't apply to mining operations, only to agricultural work. They're threatening to take it to federal court, Clara nodded thoughtfully. These legal challenges had become routine as employers sought new ways to circumvent worker protection laws. Schedule a site visit for next week. We need to document conditions before they have time to make cosmetic improvements. The meeting continued with updates from across their jurisdiction. Former indentured servants were opening small businesses with money received in legal settlements. Children who would have been forced into labor were attending newly established schools. Most significantly, a culture of fear that had dominated worker-employer relationships for generations was slowly giving way to something approaching mutual respect. After the meeting, Clara walked to her private office, a luxury she still couldn't quite believe was hers. The walls were lined with law books, territorial statutes, and framed letters from workers whose lives had been improved by the Commission's interventions. On her desk sat a photograph of the Riverbend Ranch crew, a reminder of where her journey toward justice had begun. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Clara!" The voice belonged to Rebecca Martinez, Elena's 19-year-old niece, who worked as Clara's administrative assistant. "There's a young woman here to see you. She says it's urgent." "Send her in." The woman who entered Clara's office was perhaps 17, with dark hair, frightened eyes, and the telltale signs of someone living under constant stress. Her clothes were clean but worn, and she clutched a small bundle of papers in her trembling hands. "Miss Brennan," she said hesitantly, "my name is Sarah Williams. I worked at the Paramount Estate, about 50 miles north of here." Clara gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Please sit down. Tell me what's happened." Sarah's story poured out in a rush of words, punctuated by tears. The Paramount Estate was owned by Vincent Crowe, a wealthy businessman who had moved to the territory after the Worker Protection Act made his operations in other regions legally problematic. He had recruited workers from the back east with promises of good wages and fair treatment, but the reality was a system of debt bondage that made Aldrich Blackwood's cruelty seem almost quaint by comparison. "He charges us for everything," Sarah explained, her voice shaking. "Room, board, work clothes, tools, medical care. By the time he takes out all the deductions, we owe him money instead of being paid. And if anyone complains—" She pulled back, her sleeve to reveal finger-shaped bruises on her wrist. "His foreman, Jake Morrison, he has ways of keeping people quiet. Last month, a boy named Peter tried to leave, and they said he had an accident with a horse. But I saw what really happened." Clara felt the familiar surge of anger that had driven her work for the past 2 years. Despite all the progress they'd made, predators like Crowe continued to find new ways to exploit vulnerable people. "Sarah, are you willing to file a formal complaint? It would mean testifying about what you've witnessed, possibly in court." Sarah's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I'm scared, Miss Brennan. Mr. Crowe has connections. Important people come to his estate for hunting parties, politicians, judges, businessmen. What if no one believes me?" Clara leaned forward, remembering her own terror at the prospect of testifying against Aldrich Blackwood. 2 years ago, I was in your exact position. I was terrified that powerful people would destroy me for speaking the truth. But I learned something important. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite the fear because you know what's right. She stood and moved to the window overlooking the busy street below. "Do you see all those people down there? Many of them are living better lives because someone found the courage to speak up when it mattered. Your testimony could protect not just the workers currently at Paramount Estate, but prevent future victims from suffering the same abuse." Sarah wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. "What would happen to me? Where would I go if I testify?" "We have arrangements with several legitimate employers who are always looking for reliable workers," Clara explained. "Fair wages, decent conditions, no debt bondage. You wouldn't just be escaping Crowe's estate, you'd be building a real future for yourself." Over the next hour, Clara walked Sarah through the complaint process, the legal protections available to her, and the support systems the Commission had developed for worker witnesses. By the time Sarah left the office, she had signed a formal complaint and agreed to cooperate with a full investigation. That afternoon, Clara made the familiar journey back to Riverbend Ranch. Despite her important work in the capital, she tried to visit Samuel and Elena at least once a month. The ranch had become more than a sanctuary. It was the foundation that kept her grounded in her values and reminded her why the work mattered. Samuel was breaking horses in the main corral when she arrived, his movements as fluid and confident as ever. At 35, he had grown into his role as not just a successful rancher, but as an informal leader in the territory's progressive movement. His ranch had become a model for fair labor practices, and he frequently testified before legislative committees about the practical benefits of treating workers with dignity. "Clara!" Elena's voice called from the house. "Perfect timing. I just finished making your favorite apple pie." The evening meal at Riverbend Ranch had evolved into something of an institution. Workers and their families gathered around the extended Table in Samuel's dining room, sharing food, conversation, and the sense of community that made the ranch special. Tonight's group included David Chen, who had become Samuel's assistant foreman, Annie Foster, who had returned from Teachers College and now ran the territory's first school for workers' children, and several newer ranch hands who were still adjusting to being treated as partners rather than property. "Tell us about the Paramount Estate case," Annie said, as they gathered around the table. "Rebecca mentioned you had a visitor today." Clara shared Sarah Williams's story, careful to protect the young woman's privacy while conveying the seriousness of the situation. The reaction around the table was immediate and angry. These were people who understood exactly what Sarah was experiencing. "Crow thinks he's above the law because he's rich and connected," David said grimly. "Men like him see worker protection laws as obstacles to overcome rather than rights to respect." Samuel carved the roast with thoughtful precision. "What's our strategy for dealing with him? Careful investigation, solid evidence, and coordination with federal authorities," Clara replied. "If Crow is recruiting workers from other territories under false pretenses, it becomes a federal crime. That takes it out of local political influence." Elena passed around the apple pie, her expression troubled. "Mija, you've been working so hard lately. When was the last time you took a real break?" It was a fair question. Clara's dedication to her work had become all-consuming, driven by a sense of responsibility to every worker still trapped in exploitative situations. But Eleanor's concern reflected a deeper worry, that Clara was sacrificing her personal happiness for her professional mission. "There's too much work to do," Clara said, accepting a slice of pie. "Every day we delay, more people suffer, and every day you exhaust yourself, you become less effective at helping them," Samuel said gently. "Even crusaders need rest, Clara." After dinner, Clara and Samuel walked along the ranch's main road under a canopy of stars. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of grass and distant wood smoke. It was during these quiet moments that Clara felt most connected to the peace she had found at Riverbend Ranch. "Samuel," she said finally, "do you ever wonder if we're really making a difference? Sometimes it feels like we solve one problem and 3 more appear to take its place." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, considering his response. "Do you remember what I told you that first day? About Miguel, the boy who died because I didn't have the courage to speak up?" Clara nodded. "I used to think that saving one person couldn't possibly matter in the face of so much injustice, but you taught me something important. Every person we help goes on to help others. Sarah Williams will testify against Crow, and her courage will inspire other workers to come forward. The cycle continues." He paused beside the fence surrounding the main pasture, where cattle grazed peacefully in the moonlight. "The territory you're working to create, one where workers have rights and dignity, it's not just a dream anymore, Clara. It's becoming reality, one case at a time." Clara felt tears threatening, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense of purpose that still surprised her sometimes. 3 years ago, she had been a powerless servant who believed she deserved nothing better than cruelty and exploitation. Now she was helping to reshape an entire society's understanding of human dignity and workers' rights. "There's something I need to tell you," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been offered a position with the Federal Department of Labor in Washington. They want me to help develop worker protection policies for all the Western territories." Samuel's expression remained carefully neutral. "That's an incredible opportunity. How do you feel about it?" "Terrified," Clara admitted, "but also excited. The work we've done here could be replicated throughout the West. Millions of workers could benefit from stronger protections." "But," Clara smiled at how well Samuel knew her, "but leaving feels like abandoning the people who still need help here. And leaving you and Eleanor feels like losing my family." Samuel took her hand gently. "Clara, you're not abandoning anyone. You're expanding your ability to help them. And family isn't about geography. It's about love and connection that distance can't break. They walked back toward the house in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the future. Clara knew that Samuel was right. The federal position represented an unprecedented opportunity to influence policy on a national scale. But it also meant leaving behind the community that had nurtured her transformation from victim to advocate. As they reached the front porch, Elena appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of hot cocoa. "I thought you might want something warm," she said, studying their faces carefully. "You both look like you've been having serious conversations." "Clara has a decision to make," Samuel said, accepting his cup gratefully. Elena settled into her favorite rocking chair, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the cool evening air. The federal job in Washington. Clara stared at her in surprise. "How did you—" "Mija, you think news like that stays secret in a territory this small?" Elena chuckled. "I've been wondering when you'd tell us about it." "What do you think I should do?" Elena rocked slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I think you should remember what brought you here in the first place. You were running from something terrible, and you found something beautiful. Now you have the chance to help other people make that same journey. But the work here isn't finished." "The work is never finished, Clara. There will always be people who need help, injustices that need correcting. The question is where you can do the most good." Clara sipped her cocoa, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. "I keep thinking about all the workers in other territories who don't have anyone fighting for them, places where there's no Worker Protection Act, no commission to investigate complaints." "Then you have your answer," Samuel said simply. 3 weeks later, Clara stood in the same conference room where she had held her first staff meeting as regional director. This time, she was saying goodbye to the team she had built and the work that had defined her adult life. The commission would continue under new leadership, but Clara knew she was leaving behind more than a job. She was leaving behind the place where she had discovered her true calling. Thomas Grant, her legal counsel, had been promoted to interim director. Jessica Walsh would take over field investigations. The systems and procedures Clara had developed would ensure continuity, but she couldn't help feeling like a mother leaving her children. "Remember," she told the assembled staff, "every complaint matters. Every investigation has the potential to change someone's life completely. Don't let bureaucracy or politics make you forget that we exist to serve people who have no other advocates." The farewell party at Riverbend Ranch that evening was both celebration and wake. Workers from throughout the region had gathered to honor Clara's contributions and wish her well in Washington, but underneath the festivities lay a deep sadness at seeing her go. As the evening wound down and guests began heading home, Clara found herself alone with Samuel and Elena on the front porch where she had spent so many peaceful evenings. "I have something for you," Samuel said, disappearing into the house and returning with a small wrapped package. "A reminder of where you came from and what you've accomplished." Clara unwrapped the gift to find a leather-bound journal with her initials embossed in gold. Inside the front cover, Samuel had written, "For Clara Brennan, who learned that mistakes don't deserve pain and taught a territory that compassion is stronger than cruelty." "I'll write in it every day," Clara promised, tears flowing freely. "Now, and when the work gets difficult, I'll remember that everything good in my life started here." The next morning, Clara boarded the eastbound train that would take her to her new life in Washington. As the locomotive pulled away from the station, she watched the familiar landscape of her adopted home disappear behind clouds of steam and smoke. But Clara Brennan was no longer the terrified young woman who had once needed rescuing. She was a force for justice in her own right, carrying the lessons of Riverbend Ranch to a broader stage where they could help transform a nation's understanding of human dignity and workers' rights. The plate she had dropped in Aldrich Blackwood's dining room had been the catalyst for her transformation. Now, as the train carried her toward new challenges and opportunities, Clara carried within herself the unbreakable truth that Samuel Rivers had taught her. Mistakes don't deserve pain, and every human being deserves the chance to build a life of dignity and purpose. The scared servant girl was gone forever, replaced by a woman whose courage would continue to echo through the halls of power, ensuring that future generations of workers would never have to endure what she had survived. Her journey from victim to advocate was complete, but her mission to protect the vulnerable was just beginning. Washington, D.C., 1892. 5 years later, the imposing marble steps of the United States Capitol building gleamed in the morning sun, as Clara Brennan adjusted her navy blue suit and checked her notes one final time. At 28, she had become one of the most respected voices in American labor policy, but standing before Congress still made her heart race with the same nervous energy she'd felt during her first testimony against Aldrich Blackwood. Today marked the culmination of 3 years of tireless work, the congressional hearing on the National Worker Protection Act, legislation that would extend the protections Clara had helped pioneer in her home territory to workers across the entire United States. As she climbed the steps, Clara's mind drifted to the letter she'd received from Elena just that morning. Samuel had married Annie Foster the previous spring, and they were expecting their first child. David Chen had purchased his own small ranch with money saved from his fair wages at Riverbend. The Territorial Workers' Rights Commission had expanded to cover 8 states, with over 100 investigators protecting workers who once had no voice. Most remarkably, Aldrich Blackwood had died the previous winter, alone, bankrupt, and forgotten. His estate had been sold to pay legal judgments to former workers, and the Gothic mansion Clara remembered with such terror now served as a school for the children of working families. "Miss Brennan?" A young congressional aide approached her, nervously. "The committee is ready for your testimony." Clara nodded and followed him through the ornate hallways she'd grown to know well during her time in Washington. The Federal Department of Labor had proven to be everything she'd hoped, a platform to influence policy on a national scale and protect millions of workers who faced the same exploitation she had once endured. The committee room was packed with spectators, journalists, and lobbyists representing various interests. Clara recognized several familiar faces: industrialists who opposed worker protection laws, reform advocates who supported them, and fellow survivors of workplace abuse who had traveled to Washington to witness this historic moment. Committee. Chairman Senator Robert Harrison called the session to order. The committee recognizes Miss Clara Brennan, Federal Director of Worker Protection Policy, to testify regarding House Bill 847, the National Worker Protection Act. Clara approached the witness table, her leather portfolio containing not just policy papers, but also photographs and letters from workers whose lives had been transformed by the protections she advocated. She had learned over the years that statistics and legal arguments were important, but human stories were what truly moved politicians to action. "Honorable Chairman and distinguished members of the committee," Clara began, her voice carrying the confidence born of experience and conviction. "5 years ago, I was a servant working under conditions that would horrify any civilized society. Today, I stand before you as proof that when we protect workers' rights, we unleash human potential that benefits our entire nation." She spoke for 20 minutes, weaving together personal narrative, policy analysis, and economic data to make the case for comprehensive worker protection. Clara described the multiplying effects of dignity in the workplace, how protected workers were more productive, more innovative, and more likely to contribute to their community's prosperity. The legislation before you today, Clara concluded, represents more than regulatory policy. It represents our nation's commitment to the fundamental principle that every person deserves to earn their living without fear of exploitation or abuse. The questions that followed were predictably challenging. Senator William Mitchell, a known opponent of labor reform, attempted to paint worker protection laws as obstacles to economic growth. "Miss Brennan," Mitchell said with barely concealed condescension, "don't you think these regulations will drive businesses overseas and eliminate American jobs?" Clara had faced this argument countless times. "Senator, the territories that implemented strong worker protections have experienced unprecedented economic growth. When workers are treated fairly, they become more skilled, more loyal, and more productive. Our policies don't eliminate jobs, they create better jobs. But at what cost to business owners? The cost of treating human beings with basic dignity. Senator, I would argue that's not a cost at all. It's an investment in our nation's future." The hearing continued for 3 hours, with Clara fielding questions about implementation costs, enforcement mechanisms, and constitutional authority. By the time she was dismissed, Clara felt cautiously optimistic about the bill's prospects. That evening, Clara attended a reception hosted by the National Association of Labor Advocates, an organization she had helped establish 2 years earlier. The ballroom was filled with people whose lives had been touched by the worker protection movement, former factory workers who had become union leaders, immigrants who had escaped exploitative conditions, and reformers from across the political spectrum. As Clara moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and discussing strategy, she noticed a familiar face near the refreshment table. Margaret Sinclair, the lawyer who had represented her during the Blackwood trial, was engaged in animated conversation with several congressional wives. "Clara," Margaret exclaimed, embracing her former client, "I heard your testimony was magnificent. Today, Margaret, what are you doing in Washington?" "I've been appointed to the Federal Circuit Court," Margaret said with obvious pride, "partly thanks to the reputation I built on cases like yours. The president wanted judges who understood worker protection issues." Clara felt a surge of pride. For her former advocate, "You've earned every bit of success, Margaret. None of this would have been possible without your courage in taking on the Blackwood case, and none of it would have mattered without your courage in testifying," Margaret replied. "You changed everything, Clara, not just for yourself, but for countless people who didn't even know they needed protection." As the evening wound down, Clara found herself on the hotel balcony overlooking the Potomac River. The lights of the capital city twinkled below, each one representing the lives and dreams of people who would be affected by the legislation she had spent years crafting. A gentle voice interrupted her thoughts. "Mind if I join you?" Clara turned to see Catherine Walsh, a fellow advocate who had become one of her closest friends in Washington. Catherine had grown up in the industrial slums of Chicago and understood worker exploitation from a different but equally painful perspective. "How are you feeling about tomorrow's vote?" Catherine asked, settling beside Clara at the balcony railing. "Nervous," Clara admitted. "We've come so far, but there's still so much opposition. What if we lose?" Catherine smiled. "Do you remember what you told me when I was afraid to testify before the Senate Labor Committee last year?" Clara shook her head. "You said that courage isn't about knowing you'll win. It's about fighting for what's right, regardless of the outcome." Catherine paused. "Even if this bill fails, you've already changed America, Clara. Look at what's happened since you first spoke up." Clara did look, not just at the city below, but at the journey that had brought her here. 8 states now had comprehensive worker protection laws modeled on the policies she'd helped develop. Hundreds of labor advocates worked in government positions that hadn't existed 5 years earlier. Most importantly, a generation of workers was growing up believing they deserved dignity and fair treatment rather than accepting abuse as inevitable. The next morning brought news that Clara had hardly dared to hope for. The National Worker Protection Act had passed the House of Representatives by a margin of 47 votes. The legislation would now move to the Senate, where the outcome remained uncertain, but the victory was significant nonetheless. As Clara prepared for another day of meetings and lobbying, she found a telegram waiting at her hotel desk. It was from Samuel, and it contained just 7 words: "Proud of you. Miguel would be too." Those words brought tears to Clara's eyes. Miguel, the young man whose death had inspired Samuel to intervene when she was being beaten, had become a symbol for Clara of all the workers who hadn't lived to see the changes she was fighting to implement. Every policy victory, every protection extended, every life improved, was also a tribute to those who had suffered in silence. 6 months later, the Senate passed the National Worker Protection Act by a single vote. President Benjamin Harrison signed it into law on a crisp October morning, with Clara standing just behind him as he put pen to paper. The legislation established federal standards for working conditions, created a national system for investigating abuse complaints, and provided legal protections for workers who reported violations. As Clara watched the president's signature make her life's work into the law of the land, she thought about the broken plate that had started it all. That moment of clumsiness and terror had seemed like the end of everything she valued. Instead, it had been the beginning of a transformation that reached far beyond her personal circumstances. That evening, Clara began writing in the journal Samuel had given her years earlier. She had filled dozens of similar volumes since leaving Riverbend Ranch, documenting not just her daily experiences, but also the larger story of how individual courage could create systemic change. "Today," she wrote, "a law took effect that will protect millions of American workers from the exploitation I once endured. But more than that, it represents a fundamental shift in how our society views the relationship between power and vulnerability. We have declared as a nation that mistakes don't deserve pain, and that every person, regardless of their circumstances, deserves to be treated with dignity." Clara paused in her writing to look out the window of her Washington apartment. Somewhere, in the distance, workers were finishing their shifts under conditions that were safer and more humane because of the protections she had helped create. Former servants, factory workers, miners, and farmhands were going home to their families without fear of arbitrary punishment or exploitation. The scared young woman who had dropped a plate in Aldrich Blackwood's dining room could never have imagined this moment. But that woman's courage to speak truth to power had set in motion changes that would protect future generations of American workers. Clara Brennan had learned that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simplest acts of human decency. Samuel Rivers' words, "Mistakes don't deserve pain," had become not just a personal philosophy, but a national principle enshrined in federal law. As she closed her journal and prepared for bed, Clara smiled at the thought of tomorrow's challenges. There would always be more work to do, more people who needed protection, more injustices that demanded correction. But tonight she could rest in the knowledge that she had helped build a more just society, one where dropping a plate would never again justify the systematic destruction of human dignity. The servant girl was gone, replaced by a woman whose courage had changed a nation. And in that transformation lay proof that no one is powerless when they find the strength to speak the truth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just a click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.